It's my pleasure to introduce Eric Trager, our next speaker, who will be talking about Egypt. Eric is an FPRI Associate Scholar, a PhD candidate at the University of Pennsylvania, and an Ira Weiner Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He's written for Commentary Magazine, The Atlantic Online, Foreign Affairs, and The New Republic. He spent a significant time in Egypt conducting research for his dissertation on Egyptian governance, where he interviewed over 100 opposition leaders, and he has been a frequent speaker and contributor at FPRI. So please join me in welcoming Eric.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I just want to thank FPRI for inviting me, and I want to thank you for coming out this weekend and taking some time to discuss some pretty important developments in the Middle East. Today's topic is about elections, repression, succession, and the future of Egypt. That's a lot of things, so we're going to try to cover them in 45 minutes. I want to start out with a little overview that's going to give you a sense of why this matters, why I find this interesting, and how I got to this. I'm going to give you a history of how party politics worked in Egypt. My Skype is on. From 1952 to 2011. And then we'll talk about kind of post-Mubarak party politics, which is to say, how politics may function. Obviously, we don't totally know, especially once the elections get underway next month, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Okay, so overview. I just want to kind of go back to 2005, tell you a little story, and then kind of explain how I got involved in this. Now, in the 2005 presidential elections, you had many candidates, but you had three major candidates. So the first one you all know, Hosni Mubarak, who was running for his fifth term. He's from the NDP, the National Democratic Party. Now, this was the first election ever in which he was going to run against other candidates. Previously, it had been an election by national referendum, which of course he always won, but under pressure from the international community, he agreed to have multi-candidate presidential elections. So he was the big one. The second one was a guy named Ayman Noor. Now, Ayman Noor had previously been a member of a party known as the Waft Party. He had defected due to a variety of circumstances and created this party called Ghad, or Tomorrow, the Tomorrow Party. And he started running actually a very serious campaign against Hosni Mubarak, against expectations. I mean, the expectations were that anyone running against a dictator would be very conservative, would not really attack Hosni Mubarak, but Ayman Noor ran a serious campaign. The third candidate was Naaman Goma, who was the leader of the Waft Party, the party that Ayman Noor had defected from. Anyway, the election was held September 7th, 2005. Not surprisingly, Hosni Mubarak did pretty well, 88.6%. Naaman Goma, who I've interviewed him, he's incredibly unimpressive, got 2.8%. I mean, there are like all sorts of stories about just how unimpressive he was. My favorite is that he was like kind of caught still mic'd, cursing people out after he'd stepped off a podium. We're going to try not to let that happen today, right? And this has an off button. And Ayman Noor, who had run this very, very serious campaign against Mubarak, got 7.3%. Now, that sounds like, Ron Paul territory, actually. But people say that Ayman Noor actually did a lot better than 7.3%, but that due to rigging, he had that low number. Of course, because he ran such a serious campaign against the dictator, he was subsequently thrown in prison. Fast forward now to 2008, when I am trying to find a dissertation topic, right? So I go to Egypt. It's July 2008, and I study political science at Penn. So I want to find a topic that has to do with actually something totally different that's completely irrelevant, as I find out when I arrive in Egypt. This happens all the time for PhD students. So I decide to seek out the Ghad Party, the Tomorrow Party, Ayman Noor's party, and see what's happened to it since Ayman Noor was thrown in prison. So I'm referred to this guy, Mustafa Musa. I talked to Musa. Now again, Ayman Noor is still in prison, right? So I'm talking to Mustafa Musa. I actually took that photo of him. He has very bright offices. I ask him what he thinks of Ayman Noor, And he doesn't like Aymanur, which I thought was very odd. But I think, okay, maybe these two guys had ego differences. You know, they resented each other. Aymanur is this big star. He's a martyr in a certain sense because he's in prison. Musa is jealous. Musa also says some strange things, like that he doesn't think that there's a genocide in the Sudan, so he doesn't seem quite as liberal as Aymanur says as Aymanur is. But I don't really think anything of it. Anyway, I interview Mustafa Musa for 2 hours. I then go to meet a member of a civil society organization, and I say, hey, I just came from interviewing the leader of the Tomorrow Party. And he says, that's weird. Did you go to prison to interview Aymanur? I said, no. I went to interview Mustafa Musa. And the guy looks at me and says, you're an idiot. And I said, why am I an idiot? He says, because that's the fake Tomorrow Party. You see, okay, what the regime had done is while Aymanur was in prison, it had taken someone within his party who A, hated him, right? And B, was actually tied to the regime through various family and business connections and said, we'll either give you the same fate as Aymanur, or you're going to start this party. We're going to give you the license to the Tomorrow Party name, so you will be the chairman of the Tomorrow Party, even though you're really a regime puppet. And he plays that role very effectively, quite frankly. He fooled me, and he's fooled, I think, some Egyptians, maybe not anymore. And so I was referred then, of course, across the square practically to the real Tomorrow Party, where I met this guy. So basically, I said, wow, there are fake parties in Egypt. This is a dissertation, right? It's something. Okay, so what's the kind of the takeaway here, right? Historically, Egyptian opposition parties are tools of the regime, which is to say that they exist and survive at the pleasure of the regime. I'm going to go into this a little bit more, but the bottom line is that Aymanur ran against Mubarak because he was allowed to run against Mubarak. And the second that he really ran against Mubarak, that he really started criticizing the regime, he was thrown in prison and his party was just given to somebody else. In other circumstances, his party might have been broken up. There might have been ways to kind of create fights within the party to kill it, right? So these opposition parties are not real. The official ones are not real. They exist and survive at the pleasure of the regime. State security, which is a domestic security service, frequently infiltrates parties, and it co-opts key party leaders. So, for example, I have a photo here of a man named Rafat El Said. By the way, he hates me. I spent a lot of time around his party headquarters in March, and he was like really not pleased to see me because I brought up in an interview with him, Mr. Said, you say that you're an opponent of the Mubarak regime. You're the chairman of this opposition party. But isn't it true that you own a press that prints publications on behalf of the government? He denied it, but actually everyone in his party said, oh, yeah, he does that, right? Because party leaders are co-opted. Someone is allowed to become a party leader only if there are very obvious ways in which the regime could crush that person if they seriously start criticizing. So in this case, he has business interests. He's also an appointed member of the Senate, which is kind of the upper house of the parliament. So he gets a lot from the regime in exchange for basically being a fake opposition leader. And as a result of this, parties have really limited constituencies. I mean, people sort of figure it out. It's an open secret, and was certainly under Mubarak, that these parties weren't really effective, weren't really able to push the limits of speech. And that's why actually during the revolution, or I would actually call it more of a revolt, the young people that you saw in Tahrir Square, for the most part, were not affiliated with parties. They had actually deliberately avoided the parties because they knew that the parties were just not effective mechanisms for really protesting the regime. All right, let's move on. Party politics in Egypt, 1952 to 2011. So we'll move back even further, right? Initially, what you had in Egypt was a monarchy that became a constitutional monarchy. I have up 1922 to 1952. That's the general dates. Certainly, the 1922 is a bit questionable because the actual constitution is from 1923, but okay, whatever. Major party of that period is the Waft, which I've already mentioned. It means the delegation. That's Saad Zaghloul. He's an important revolutionary figure from the 1919 revolution that resisted British rule in Egypt. So the major party is a new friend of mine has popped up on Skype. The major party is Waft, and they are sort of seen as the counterbalancer to the monarchy, right? But then you have the 1952 Free Officers' Revolution, which brings Mohammed Naguib and then shortly thereafter Nasser to power, right? So first they take down the king, then they shut off the party system. So what you have for a while is actually a total military dictatorship. But then in 1962, really for political administrative purposes, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president, establishes the ASU, the Arab Socialist Union. It's intended to be a political party that's going to unify Nasser's supporters and really dominate the political sphere. So in 1970, Nasser dies and Sadat becomes president. Now, Sadat's an interesting figure because what he basically tries to do is move away from the anti-Westernism of Nasser towards, first of all, a more open economy. So that's called the infitah. It means economic opening. Secondly, he tries to shift Egypt from being a Soviet ally to being a U.S. ally. Of course, towards the end of the decade of the 1970s, in 1978, 1979, he makes a peace treaty with Israel. But part of this process of kind of westernizing and opening up for at least a brief period involves the party system. So what he basically does is he takes that ASU, again, that party, that single party that Nasser created, and he divides it into 3 platforms. And the idea is that this is going to, start multi-party rule in Egypt. So first what he does is he makes, 3 platforms. One of those is the left, and that's led by Khalid Mohiuddin, and that becomes the Tagamu Party, okay? Just kind of bracket off Tagamu Party. The right flank is led by a man named Mustafa Kamal Murad, and it later becomes Al-Ahrar. And of course, Sadat makes himself the center party, right? Because where better for you to be if you're trying to have multi-party elections but win than to put yourself in the center. Now, one point I want to make on this, and it sort of shows the way in which parties are never, obviously this is never going to be a competitive party system because the dictator created these parties, but to make sure that that's the case, Khalid Mohiuddin and Mustafa Kamal Murad, along with Anwar Sadat, are part of that Free Officers' Revolution from 1952 that takes down the monarchy. So these are colleagues from the military who worked together 24 years prior to bring down the prior regime. They're friends. They're not likely to compete with each other, and to really make sure that he has a grip on the system, the head of the center party, Sadat is the president of the country and a member of the center party, of the Egypt party, which is the center. But the head of that party is his brother-in-law. So Sadat really has complete control over this so-called multi-party system until the Tagamu party becomes too oppositional, so they suddenly create the Labour Party, which is intended to draw away from the Tagamu party. So again, he creates a multi-party system, he has firm control over it, and when he loses control over it, when the Tagamu party actually becomes a little bit oppositional, Sadat approves the establishment of another left-wing party that's supposed to draw away from the other left-wing party that is moving against him. Moving on. So in 1978, let's go to 77. In 1977, there are a series of protests against the regime called the Bread Riots. This happens in January of 1977, and it hurts kind of the image of the Egypt Party, which is the center platform that Sadat has established. So to kind of remake his image, Sadat establishes the National Democratic Party, the NDP, to kind of, again, give a new image to the regime. What of course happens is that the people who were members of the Egypt Party, again, the center platform, leave the Egypt Party, join the NDP, so really he's just completely repackaged the same product. In 1981, of course, Sadat is assassinated, Mubarak becomes president, and then, you have rule under Mubarak, which is essentially one-party rule under the NDP with a few opposition parties that we'll talk about in depth. So party politics under Mubarak, the NDP typically wins in elections, which are held regularly, 75% of the parliament or more, right? It's a clientelist system. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you know, we'll talk about the various ways in which parliamentary candidates win elections, but the key way that they win elections is by providing services, is by building not just roads, but giving people jobs, giving them money, selling them land at below market prices. I mean, there's a whole corrupt network that links members of the NDP, and particularly parliamentarians, to the public. So I'm not suggesting for a moment that these people are really elected in democratic fashion, but I am suggesting that NDP parliamentarians, that is the ruling party parliamentarians, had support because of a system that was built on the exchange of services. And again, these are services that go well beyond what we would find acceptable in the United States. So this is not just a matter of building roads, it's a matter of like giving people jobs, of giving them money and that sort of thing. Now, elections are won by a number of other tactics on and around Election Day. The first is the use of thugs or big families. So especially if you're a businessman, you'll go out, you'll hire some thugs, and the thugs do a number of things. They stuff ballot boxes, they intimidate people around polls, they beat up opponents, and I've heard all sorts of numbers cited as to what a thug costs. This is true, I tried to interview a thug. I did. I sent my translator out to a certain neighborhood where we knew that they hung out, and it didn't materialize, which is probably a good thing. But so thugs. The other thing is big families, and this is particularly important in more tribal areas of the country, in the Delta and in the South, which is known as Upper Egypt. Now, what this essentially means is that Egypt is a tribal country, so if you come from a well-established family, you're going to have a lot of people who can let's say, mobilize voters, or who can use weapons to intimidate voters, or who can just so control the village that your chance of victory is almost assured. And you got to remember, with the big families in particular, they typically aligned with the ruling party because they wanted services, they wanted money from the regime, they wanted access to all of the things that the government offered, and the way to do that typically was to be linked with the ruling party. That's why that's probably the primary reason they did it. Now, okay, other ways elections were won: ballot stuffing, vote buying, deal making. Really interesting. Basically, if you wanted to win, you almost definitely had to have some sort of conversation with either a ruling party leader or a state security officer or other parties in which you essentially agree to do or not do certain things in exchange for being allowed to run, for sure, and typically in order to be allowed to win. Because once the ballots were cast, if they were even cast, sometimes polling stations were shut down entirely. There were all sorts of things that could happen behind the scenes in terms of removing, stuffed boxes or stuffing boxes. I mean, this is a very dirty political system under Mubarak. And the key player in all of this is state security, right? State security is managing these affairs locally. State security is involved in the deal making between different candidates in the ruling party. They're following the parties. They're making sure that nothing too critical is said of the regime. And I think that's what I'm going to talk about, in a little bit. So let's talk now about opposition parties, all right? The first key component of opposition parties and what makes them fake under Mubarak is that they had to be approved by the Committee on Political Parties. Now, the Committee on Political Parties is a body that is heavily dominated by the ruling party. So what that means is if let's say you want to start a party, it's going to be a liberal party, you have to fill out an application. You submit it to the Committee on Political Parties, then you have a meeting. At that meeting, the technical points that they're going to raise are, well, how is your party different from these other 5 parties that are out there, right? So you have to make that point. But the second thing that the Committee on Political Parties is obviously looking at is, well, how likely are you to seriously mobilize against Mubarak's ruling party, the NDP? How likely is it that you're going to pose a threat? So you remember Ayman Noor, back in that first story I was talking about, Ayman Noor submitted applications for the Tomorrow Party 4 times. And it was only approved on the 4th time when it looked like a court, now the courts in Egypt are slightly independent under Mubarak, slightly, when it looked like a court was going to grant him the license. So the committee said, well, we don't want to be embarrassed, we'll grant him a license. But anyway, the Committee on Political Parties is really essential when it comes to approving and more likely not approving parties. Now, there are also a lot of parties, right? By January 2011, in fact, there were 23 official parties. Don't read that number as being in stone, because the truth of the matter is that it's hard to know at times when a party was very active and when a party had been kind of taken out of existence. Now, the parties that I'm really going to focus on for the remainder of the address are going to be the major ones. I mean, and there were about 4 or 5. But you also had, let's say, 17 or 18 other official parties that were essentially a guy in an office, believe it or not, with a butler, right? So, you know, you'd go to interview, I would go to interview this guy, he's the chairman of the Conservative Party. I mean, there's nothing doing in this office. There are no people there. There are no supporters. It's really a raggedy hole in the wall, but there's someone there serving me tea. Like that was, I mean, that was really all that was there. These parties really existed on paper, and they received various benefits for continuing to exist, which I'll talk about in a bit. The key parties, though, were the WAFT, which I've discussed. It's a liberal party, really from the pre-Nasser era, from before 1952, banned after 1952, but resurrected in 1983. Tagamu, which again was that first left platform that Sadat had established in 1976, a Nasserist party, which was established in 1992, which is kind of leftist and nationalist, the Ghad Party, which is the Tomorrow Party, it's Ayman Noor's party, which is liberal, and the Democratic Front Party. Those were really like the major parties on the eve of the January 2011 revolt. And notice, and this is very important, that there were no Islamist parties, right? Islamism is a very important political movement and set of political ideas in Egypt, and yet there were no approved Islamist parties. Why? Because Islamists were seen, correctly seen, as posing the greatest threat to the viability of the regime. Now, that didn't mean that Islamists didn't run in elections. In fact, the Muslim Brotherhood in 2005, due to an interesting set of circumstances, won 20% of the seats. But those Muslim brothers ran as independents. So Islamists could not form parties, but they could run under certain circumstances with certain deals with the regime as independents. Now, another important feature of party politics under Mubarak was something called the red lines. Now, this is actually a phrase that's really important within Egyptian politics. So it involved a number of things. First of all, no criticism of the military, period. No criticism of military actions, of major generals, no asking to inspect budgets, no criticism of military expenditures, very important. This is still a very sensitive issue today, now that the military is ruling the country. The last thing that the military wants is oversight of its budgets. That is for them still a red line. Moving on. No personal criticism of the president or his family. So I've spoken to, at this point, close to 200 opposition leaders in Egypt, and pre-revolution, I would say to them, well, you're not a real opposition party. You never criticize the president. They'd say, no. I do, but I do it in a respectful way. They always say, I do it in a respectful way. I don't curse him. I don't criticize what he looks like. I respectfully disagree with his policies, right? They didn't even really do that most of the time. But what this meant is, for example, when Ibrahim Issa, who he wasn't a member of a party, but he was the editor of an important independent newspaper, when he printed news that Mubarak was ill in 2008, he was thrown in prison. And he was imprisoned for 2 months. So you can't comment on the president as a person. No boycotting elections, right? It's not useful to the regime if you're going to be a fake party, but then you're not going to participate in the fake elections that the regime has set up. So you do not boycott elections. If you boycott elections, you'll be punished in a number of different ways. One of which is, well, okay, you're not going to have any parliamentarians, which is a huge punishment because it means that you're completely off the scene, right? If you don't have parliamentarians and you're an opposition party in Egypt, you effectively don't exist because no one's hearing from you, period, right? But the other way that you could be heard is they'll send state security to infiltrate the party. Right? They'll remove the leader and replace him with some puppet leader, as I described with the Tomorrow Party, with the God Party. So no boycotting elections, right? Don't affiliate with mass movements. That includes Islamist movements, right? So parties should not meet with the Muslim Brotherhood, or they should only meet with them in limited circumstances. They should not meet with liberal opposition movements. Again, not parties. I'm talking here about, for example, the 2005 movement, 2004 movement, 2005 movement known as Kifaya, which was a movement that very explicitly said enough. Kifaya means enough. In other words, enough of the Mubarak regime. So these parties really had to stay separate from mass movements, including Islamists and liberals. They had to avoid foreign support. Right? They don't want a fake opposition party suddenly picking up steam because it gets a nice grant from the United States. And they impose strict controls on holding public events. So anytime you want to hold a conference, you have to get permission from state security. And state security might say, well, I need a full list of everyone who's attending. This guy can't come. This guy can't speak. You might still get approval, and then 2 days before the conference, the hotel gets a call, sorry, you can't host this conference. People show up 2 days later, conference can't be held. I mean, this happens, seriously. So there are strict controls on holding public events. Everything should be within the party headquarters, and in only the rarest of circumstances are things approved outside of headquarters. So the question is like, and this is always the big question to me, if this is so constricted and so obviously fake, and everyone knows that these opposition parties are not really opposing Mubarak in a serious way, you know, why do it? What's the point, right? Why not sit at home and do something else? First answer is parliamentary immunity. So what this means is that you're not liable in most circumstances to being criminally charged. In a country where there's a large, let's say, black market and a lot of corruption, right? Having parliamentary immunity is a very, very helpful thing for doing all sorts of business deals, right? Or having a friend who has parliamentary immunity is a really, really useful thing. I was meeting actually yesterday with a delegation, a business delegation from Egypt, and they said, you know, the cost of doing business in Egypt is always 5% more than you think it's going to be because of all the bribes you have to pay. I frankly think it's more than that. But having parliamentary immunity means that you can ask for bribes, you could pay bribes, whatever, but never really run the risk of getting caught. Because remember, law and order in Egypt under Mubarak is not consistent. So they can go after you even if everyone's doing it if they feel like it. So parliamentary immunity is key. You get money from the regime, right? This explains kind of the one guy in an office with a butler who calls himself a party. He gets $84,000. That's a huge amount of money. He's supposed to write a newspaper. I haven't seen one. You get some rights, right? You get headquarters, a newspaper, and you get to run limited campaigns. I mean, you're supposed to run a newspaper. I think technically they all do. What I have here is the WAFT newspaper. It's really the only opposition newspaper that's run daily, and the WAFT headquarters. Now, that's a beautiful headquarters. That's a villa. It's an old mansion. Most headquarters don't look like that, which is why it's hard to find an image on Google of any other party headquarters. So you get to have a headquarters. You get to have some sort of physical presence and a newspaper, even if you're not really doing anything serious. And then there are some other reasons why people join these parties. One is to survive Mubarak. There was this idea that, well, okay, I'm a communist. I can't really be a communist now because of Mubarak. But if I go away, if my party doesn't survive, then who's going to be communists when Mubarak falls? So I just need to play with Mubarak now. I need to deal with him. I need to make deals just so I survive because he's old. He's going to die, right? And then I'll be Egypt's communist, right? So that's one reason. That's another kind of more ideological reason why people would participate in this system. And the other reason is because there's no other choice. You know, if you're a liberal and you don't want to go to jail under Mubarak, kind of the only best way to be a liberal, so to speak, may be to join these parties. And obviously it's not a good way, but I think genuinely there were members of these parties who felt, well, I'm in this because I'm a political person, and sort of what else am I going to do if I want to be a liberal or a communist or whatever the ideology happens to be. All right. So just kind of bring this kind of Mubarak era story together. Opposition parties before the revolt are, first of all, decorative. This is, you'll remember Mustafa Musa, the fake Tomorrow Party leader, right? He's on state TV. He's on a show called Cairo Today. He's identifying himself as the leader of the Tomorrow Party. So people watch, they say, oh, you know, look, there is some sort of debate. There is some sort of opposition in Egypt, even though he's not really oppositional. A vote for him is really a vote for the regime, but it's decorative. And actually, a lot of opposition parties would come into the meetings with me, and they'd say, I don't know why you're interviewing me. We're decorative. But they are decorative. They're there to make it look like there's an opposition. The other thing is that the opposition, again, was collaborators and not challengers. So what I have here is campaign literature, also from the Mustafa Musa wing of the Tomorrow Party, that fake wing of the Tomorrow Party, where a candidate, which you see on the bottom, is actually asking people to vote for him, and on his campaign literature is Hosni Mubarak, right? It's like if Romney says vote for me, I like Obama, right? I mean, it's crazy. I mean, it wouldn't happen because these are collaborators. They're not challengers. They're really not. And this is like the best evidence of it. They're really not running against Mubarak and the ruling party. They also have little street presence, right? They have little street presence again because, remember, they're not allowed to have public events except in very rare circumstances. They're not allowed to affiliate with mass movements, with Islamist movements that are kind of more among the people, as you've been hearing a couple times today. So they have no street presence. They're sort of locked away in their headquarters, occasionally on TV. And therefore, and this is not surprising, on the eve of the January 25th revolt, which is what we'll talk about next, most opposition parties declined to participate officially. They had all sorts of excuses as to why they weren't joining these demonstrations, one of which was it's disrespectful, right? It's disrespectful to do it on this day because the day that the revolt was planned was on Police Day, and it's wrong to protest the police. So that sounds kind of like what I've been saying, which is that these parties were not serious challengers to the regime. They didn't intend to challenge the regime. At best, they wanted to survive it. At worst, they wanted to continue collaborating so they could get certain benefits, including money and parliamentary immunity. All right, so now what, right? Mubarak I was asking now what when I was being evacuated from Egypt, having done half of my research in January, like, uh-oh, right? No, but actually the story stays sort of interesting, right? So let's talk about just kind of the general features of post-Mubarak party politics. So the first of which is, of course, Mubarak resigned and the parliament was dissolved on February 11, 2011, and the military took over, right? So Egypt is now ruled by the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, or SCAF. That's Field Marshal Mohammed al-Tantawi. He's the Minister of Defense, appointed by Mubarak, but now essentially the leader of the country. Day-to-day governance is managed by a SCAF-appointed technocratic government, which is led by Issam Sharaf. And there's a parliamentary and presidential timeline. Basically, you're going to have parliamentary elections in 3 stages, November 28th, I believe December 14th, and January 3rd. After that, that parliament will create a constitution. After that, you'll have a presidential election. After that, you'll have a new parliamentary election. Well, what I'm basically saying is that this transition is going to last a while. And we'll talk about, why is that? Is it because of incompetence? Is it because of the design of the military that doesn't really want to relinquish power? Not so clear necessarily. So the major changes is that, first of all, the NDP is officially banned. Mubarak's party is banned. That is the headquarters of the NDP in downtown Cairo. It was set on fire on January 28th. and there's no chance that it will be rebuilt in that form anytime soon, and it's been legally banned. So there are at least 25 newly approved parties, including the Muslim Brotherhood's party. So you've just had this real flurry of activity where sort of a lot of major political figures, some of whom were already in parties, some of whom were never in parties, but were still outspoken political thinkers, have created parties. The most important of these parties, I would say, of the new parties, is the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party. It was the first party that was officially recognized by the party's committee. That was on, I believe, April 30th. And because of the Muslim Brotherhood's reach into the Egyptian public and their popularity, I think it's going to be a very important party moving forward. And now, in addition to these 25 or so parties that have been officially recognized, there are probably over 100 new parties that have formed and are still waiting for approval or getting their documents in order. I mean, I read the Egyptian press every day. Every day I'm coming across a number of new parties that I've never heard of. In some cases, they're coalitions of previous newly created parties. Sometimes they're completely new parties. It's a very, very confusing political atmosphere in that sense right now. And of course, coalitions of parties are forming. So, you have 25 newly recognized parties. The total is now, I think, 49, because you had 2 new parties that were recognized in the last week, plus these additional parties that may soon get recognition. So a lot of these parties are joining coalitions to kind of try to simplify the choices that people will face come elections, but frankly, those coalitions are not very stable. For example, the Muslim Brotherhood created a coalition that a number of its major partners recently defected from because the Brotherhood wanted to have the majority of candidates within the coalition's parliamentary list. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So there are new and confusing election laws. Bear with me on this one, all right? Okay, 33% of the seats, this is the easy part, 33% of the seats will be allocated through district-based individual candidacy elections, with each district electing a professional and a worker, right? So this is actually a system that's familiar pretty much to everyone here, right? In the sense that you elect locally 2 people, one of whom is a professional, one of whom is a worker. That designation is really a holdover from the Nasser era, and it is something that has traditionally been used for kind of corrupt purposes, because people can switch their affiliations if they're allowed to, from having once run as a worker now as a professional, and vice versa. It's really a way of kind of limiting who can win, because if you have a very, very strong professional, then you're blocking other professionals from winning that second seat. I mean, if you have a strong candidate who's a professional, you block other professionals from winning that seat, so then can they run as a worker? Anyway, the important point is 33% will be elected, 2 per district, right? 67%, the remainder, will be elected through district-based party list voting. That means that you're filling out 2 ballots, one of which you're voting for 2 candidates, 1 worker and 1 professional, their name. The second ballot, you're picking a party. Okay, that sounds simple, but the party list, first of all, must be half professionals, half workers, okay? You've heard this, okay? But the second part of that is that the winners are determined based on a district-based largest remainder system. What that means is that each district is holding its own party list election. So, for example, let's say you have 20 parties running in a certain district that's going to elect 5 seats. Now, what a largest remainder system means is that 5 seats for 1 district, you have to get 20%, right? Because 1 seat out of 5 is 20% in order to be elected. Now, if you have 20 parties running, there's actually no guarantee that anyone will get 20%, but typically, let's say 1 gets 20%. Let's say only 1 party actually gets 20% of the vote. Let's say they get 21%. Because they crossed the threshold and nobody else did, they get all 5 seats. I could explain this more in the Q&A. It's confusing a lot of people, and I actually had to read it through about 3 times before I got it myself. Okay, Briefly, the Freedom and Justice Party, which is the MB party, was approved, like I said, on April 30th. It's aligned with the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces in the sense that whereas certain parties are becoming more critical of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces rule, the Muslim Brotherhood is consistently defending the military. It is doing everything it can to avoid participating in protests against the military. Now, why is it doing that? It's doing that because it believes that the sooner elections are held, the better it will perform. The reason is because it's well organized, it's popular, and what that means is that if they held elections today, they'll do really, really well. If elections are held a year from now, when newer parties are able to organize, when newer parties feel strong and more likely to challenge them, they might not do as well. So they want elections as soon as possible. They believe that the Supreme Council of Armed Forces shares that vision and will give them that. They're obviously Islamists. That means basically that they're trying to base Egyptian law on the Sharia, which is the kind of broad principles from Islamic texts, broad legal principles from Islamic texts. They want law and legal debates to essentially be the outcome of religious debates. They're expected to win many seats in the parliamentary elections, and there's this question of whether there are internal splits. We could say that for the Q&A. And like I said, they created this coalition, the Democratic Alliance for Egypt, that I think actually gives them a lot of power in the sense that anyone who stays in this coalition and wins will owe their seat to the Muslim Brotherhood. So even if the Muslim Brotherhood they're expected to get, let's say, 30% of the vote, you could have any number of additional seats that owe their being in the parliament to the Brotherhood, and that's going to give the Brotherhood much more influence than their actual seat total would suggest. Ooh, sorry. Other parties to watch. The WAFT is actually still out there. The WAFT, even though it was a fake party or let's say a not very aggressive party under Mubarak, it's there because it's the party of the pre-1952 era. So even though it hasn't been a very effective party, it still resonates. It's still something that Egyptians read about in their history books. And if you're having a party list election where you're voting for a party name, the WAFT party could actually do well because it has a recognized name. The Free Egyptians Party, which is a liberal party that is kind of founded and managed. It's not clear exactly what his role will be by Naguib Sawiris, who's the richest Egyptian. He's Christian. It's a secular liberal party. The Adil Party is a centrist party, which was founded by one of the major Tahrir protesters. Social Democratic Party is kind of a liberal left party, also founded by Tahrir Square protesters primarily, although also some intellectuals. You have a Noor Party, which is a Salafist party. Salafists, I think you heard this earlier, but they tend to be a bit more radical in the way they interpret the Sharia than, let's say, the Muslim Brotherhood, although, again, both want a system that is essentially theocratic. The Wasat Party, actually covered in today's tomorrow's New York Times, is more of a centrist Islamist party. It broke away from the Muslim Brotherhood. Its leader broke away from the Muslim Brotherhood in the mid-90s. The Egypt Current Party, now this is a party founded by Muslim Brotherhood youth who had a disagreement over the way the Muslim Brotherhood was run after the revolt and broke away to start their own party. Not really clear how well it will perform. I actually know a lot of the people behind that. I don't expect it'll do very well because I think it's really quite small. But still, the fact they broke away from the Muslim Brotherhood was interesting because there's this theory that the Muslim Brotherhood is very cohesive. The Revolutionary Youth have tried to form a party. Those would be the youth activists that you saw a lot of on television. And other old parties, these parties still exist. They still have headquarters. They still print newspapers, some of them, especially Tagamu, the Nasserists. So it's not clear whether they'll be reformed in certain ways that allow them to participate in the new Egypt. The real wild card, though, if you really kind of want to puzzle over what the future of Egypt will look like, one thing you got to look at is the Muslim Brotherhood. How many seats will the Freedom and Justice Party win? The second thing you got to look at is what happens to former NDP parliamentarians. Now, like I said, the party is banned, but most of the members are not, right? Because a lot of people were members. Think back to what I said about these big families that help their family members win elections because they sort of control areas in more tribal regions of Egypt. They were all affiliated with the NDP. Well, now the NDP doesn't exist, but they're still there. So what do they do now? I mean, it seems like they're probably going to win because the families haven't broken down. The party has, but it could be the same people going back to parliament. Now, some of the leading members of the NDP have now come out and formed new parties made up of former ruling party members. So it's not really clear what will happen to them. Will Egyptians rally to these parties because they want stability? They see the former ruling party people as stabilizers after what's been a very difficult 10 months since Mubarak fell. Not clear how these guys will do. And I think that they'll be most competitive, though, in district-level races. And here's why I think that. I made the point about the families, but think about America, right? We have this saying in America that everyone hates Congress, but everyone loves their congressman, right? Congress has about an 18, I think actually a 13% approval rating, right? But even in landslide elections, most people re-elect their congressman. I could see the same thing happening in Egypt where people say, well, I hate the NDP, I hate Mubarak, it was really corrupt, but Mohammed Ragab, not a bad guy, right? Got my son a job, built that hospital, gave me the house gave me the land where I built my house on. I could see that happening. I could see these guys actually doing pretty well. Now, to combat this, a lot of the youth activists have created blacklists, but it's not really clear how deep that's, the kind of anti-NDP backlash is working beyond Cairo. Almost done. Just some key questions I want to leave you with. The first is, moving forward, and to really understand the future of party politics in Egypt, we have to ask, what role does the military intend to have, and really, does it intend to yield power? That's the key question. Will the military go through with its electoral timeline and then remove itself from power, return from the barracks, or does it intend to manipulate elections? Does it intend to form some sort of quiet alliance with the Brotherhood or with former NDP people or with some other party and use that to manipulate the system? Will it run fair and clean elections? Will it not run? Will it try to run a presidential candidate? Again, quietly, it's not going to explicitly say this is our candidate, but will a former general run? Actually, 2 weeks ago, I think, Tantawi, who again is the current leader of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, showed up in downtown Cairo in a suit, not in his military uniform. And people said, well, is he trying to run for president? I mean, he looked like a candidate. It doesn't seem like that's going to happen. I think it's very unlikely that he will, but could something like that happen where someone takes off their uniform, pretends to be a civilian, but in fact runs for president and is effectively a new Mubarak? Second thing is, will elections be run cleanly? This is very important. Will the NDP and other parties use thugs? Will there be a democratic process? It's critical to understanding the future of Egyptian politics. And third, what will the revolutionary youth do? How will they respond to these events? What happens if the NDP comes back to power in some form? If former NDP parliamentarians, let's say 20 to 30%, make it back to parliament, will they hold Tahrir Square again? Will they launch mass protests? Are they going to participate in elections? Are they going to boycott elections? Do they actually have any influence? These are very important questions in understanding, most importantly, I think, whether the timeline will move forward as planned. And lastly, can liberal parties make inroads? So what I basically described, I think, is a situation post-Mubarak where the Muslim Brotherhood is probably going to do pretty well. The NDP could also do very well. That's the ex-NDP people. So, what room does this leave for liberal parties? Traditionally, and remember this, Egyptian politics is not really about ideas. It's really about services. It's clientelist. It's about, can my parliamentarian get my son a job? Can he get me land? Can he build a hospital? Can he deal with roads? It's not about ideas. Does that hurt, in particular, liberal parties that are basing their claim to the future of Egypt on ideas and not really on any kind of legacy of providing services, which is very different from the NDP or even the Muslim Brotherhood, which runs its own social service network? And with that, let's have a discussion.
Hi, I'm Allison Stevens, and I'm from Mercersburg Academy, and I'm just wondering, you were talking about the red line rules during the Mubarak era. So what is the status of the press now in these elections?
That's a great question. The press in general has come under some very obvious pressure, and I think you really saw that over the weekend when you had the recent attacks on Copts. State media kind of put out this idea that the mostly Coptic protesters had attacked the military, and it called people to come out into the streets to defend the military. And while it did that, the independent stations around this area where this was happening that were filming this, that's Al Hura, Channel 25, were shut down. Al Arabiya, which is another kind of pan-Arab satellite station, was shut down. I think that gives us a sense of what might happen, particularly if the military intends to retain control. I mean, again, I just think like that is the most important question here. Obviously, the military is going to want to retain control over a story that's otherwise going to say that they killed 24 Copts. But will they try to, control the election in the same way? It's not really clear. For sure, though, and certain red lines will still be at play. Strong criticism of Tantawi or the military, I think, is still a red line. Could change, but probably not. Anything that deals with military budgets will still be a red line. No one is going to touch that. I think that's true, by the way, for many of the top protesters. I was speaking to one over the phone on Monday, and I said, after this Coptic attack, are you going to go after the military very explicitly? He said, no, that's still a red line. We're not going to explicitly call for the fall of the military regime. We're going to go after the transitional government and these ministers who are very technocratic. But I think the red lines, as far as the military are concerned, are still in play. And as for kind of broader press freedom, it really comes down to what the military wants. It's a great question, though.
I've been reading a lot about there's a lot of hand-wringing about the Muslim Brotherhood. And we've been hearing the word Islamist a lot today. Could you go into a little bit further depth as to what the Muslim Brotherhood's ideology really is and what Islamism really is, and if those perceptions that Westerners have about it are accurate to the best of your ability?
When you talk about ideology, do you mean in terms of their, do you mean in terms of their legal methodology and legal thinking?
Yes.
So it varies, okay? I mean, within Islamism, there is a wide spectrum in terms of, as in any religion, there's a wide spectrum in terms of how you're going to interpret a certain religious text that can really mean a wide variety of things. Now, if you understand it in that way, the Salafists would be kind of the most extreme, the most trying to stick to the letter of the word, the letter of the law that you would have, let's say, in the Quran or another Islamic legal text. The Brotherhood would be more towards the center in terms of allowing a slightly more expansive interpretation, we think, and I'll get to that in a second, and kind of more on the more liberal Islamist spectrum. You would have something like the Wasat Party, which I mentioned, which had broken off from the Brotherhood in the 90s. I say with some skepticism that the Brotherhood is in the center because the Brotherhood has never really made its legal methodology clear. And I think that certainly in speaking to someone like me and speaking to the press, they try to sell it in a more liberal way, but they inevitably fail. So for example, there was recently a comment from a major Brotherhood leader that they want to ban bikini bathing in Egypt and ban alcohol even for tourists. Now, sure, religious Muslims are socially conservative, as are other, people of other religions. That's understandable. But if you understand what that would mean for Egyptian tourism and the importance of tourism to the Egyptian economy, I mean, that's a very, very worrying thing, just on the domestic level, to say nothing about what they believe in foreign policy. On foreign policy, the Brotherhood says that they are peaceful. But in fact, if you really press them, they support what they would call resistance in Bosnia, Chechnya, Israel, Afghanistan, Iraq. So basically, they're nonviolent except where it matters. Look, the Muslim Brotherhood has never really been explicit about what it wants, but when it has been explicit, it's rarely been reassuring. Yeah.
Final question? Paul Dickler, FPRI. I have a follow-up question to that. To what
Sure.
extent can the military, the Egyptian military, be co-opted by the Muslim Brotherhood without losing the $2 billion in U.S. aid each year and breaking the Camp David Accords? Because those are probably two of the tripwires for the military.
Absolutely. I would flip that a little bit. I don't think that the military is likely to be co-opted by the Brotherhood in the sense that, from what we understand, and I guess you could take this with a grain of salt, it seems as though the military and the police have generally done a good job at making sure that their ranks, don't include Islamists. So they're not likely to be infiltrated or co-opted by the Islamists. They are likely to partner with the Islamists and to make certain concessions in the name of keeping power. It seems like right now the Islamists and the Muslim Brotherhood in particular don't want to focus on foreign policy because they don't want to become a target of the international community. They really want to focus on domestic policy, I think. I think they really want to focus on Islamizing various legal and social institutions so that later on they could deal with foreign policy. Now, that doesn't mean for a second that if there's a good excuse or any excuse for the Muslim Brotherhood to talk against America and Israel, that they'll seize it. I mean, and they've certainly shown that they're eager to seize those opportunities, at least rhetorically. But the military appears very committed to certainly to the peace treaty and to the relationship with the United States. The one problem, though, that the military is having, and I'm not saying this in a way to be sympathetic to the military at all, is that they don't really know how to deal with rising pressure from the public. So when you have a series of anti-Israel demonstrations in late August, culminating with the break-in of the Israeli embassy, you saw that the military really stood down and didn't intervene until I believe they got a call from President Obama saying, you gotta get these Israeli diplomats out of there, or it's gonna end in a very, very bad way. So the military, I think, is actually a lot more timid and a lot weaker than many people want to admit. And for American policy in Egypt, I mean, that is a really worrying thing, because in as much as I think the military is not a very good ally, and it's going to be very hard to remain aligned with them if they continue to launch pogroms on Copts. They're still really the only point of contact that we have in Egypt, because the alternatives are the Muslim Brotherhood, which is quite anti-American, and frankly the youth revolutionaries who are very skeptical of us, and I think actually cut their teeth in many cases protesting U.S. foreign policy, which is an untold story in its own right. So I'm not very optimistic. I'm sorry. I don't want to end on that note, but the clock is what it is, right? So,
Thank you, Eric.